part of the self-regulation action research, I decided to focus on a group of children in primary one. Because we'd recently moved into our new building, the learning environment was very different, and because we're now open plan school, the children were finding it very tricky to regulate within that new open plan environment. So I decided to form a small committee of children with a very kind of wide mixture of learners to be part of it, some that were quite confident children, some that weren't at all, but all of which were a kind of broad mix of children across primary one that were struggling with that kind of breakout area, that they seemed to think that the kind of way that they would regulate themselves within a classroom was very different with how they would regulate themselves out in the breakout area. So I formed a small group, and we very much decided to focus on the goal, plan, do, review framework with them, where they kind of took ownership of the whole project and decided what measures that they thought would be best to regulate the environment. And that was from the most basic things, as in specific rules, boardmaker rules that we would use out in the environment, because of course we'd moved into this building new, so there was none of that. So it started with that. Then they introduced a buddy bus stop, so that if children were playing out there and they didn't have anybody to play with, they thought that would be a good idea rather than children becoming upset. They formed checklists where the children they decided what a regulated environment would look like, and we took photographs of that, and then they in the committee had a little checklist that they would then check on a weekly basis, and we would then come together to review that process and decide whether that was working and what then had to be improved. We also decided that we talked about what being ready to learn looked like, and whether the way that we measured it was, we measured it across all three classes to see whether there was a reduction in the amount of time that unregulated environment took for the children to be ready to learn. Over the course of probably 5 or 6 weeks, I measured it, the three class teachers measured it just in terms of the amount of time it then took from moving from that unregulated environment as it was then to then the more regulated environment of the classroom. And we found, so we just tracked the progress of all three classes and found that actually the length of time it took them to be ready to learn reduced dramatically, but the measure actually as a byproduct was greater in the class that the class teacher was using very scripted self-regulation language. So the sound bites that she was using, because she was working with an individual in her class, that class halved the amount of time that it took within a 5-week period for them to be ready to learn. And they were able to talk far more about the plan that we were putting together, about reviewing it, whether the plan that we had worked and whether we had to make amendments to it, but also they were able to talk about that scripted language and be talking about what it was like to be ready to learn, how we would know and how the teacher would know whether they were ready to learn.